Right, hello. Now I know this kind of lore franchise rant is not the usual for me, but I might throw these up from time to time. Primaris Marines are already waiting for me to put their heads on the chopping block. But today though I'm thinking, is Games Workshop gearing up for a future reset? Something like Age of Sigmar, but with 40k. Are these the last years of 40k? Well, let me give you the too long didn't read version. No. You're not going to see the end of 40k in a couple of years, because this fear-mongering is nothing new, and it always feels to me not entirely dissimilarly to crazy people wandering down a street predicting the end of the world, or more likely nowadays Twitter. Of course, when this typically doesn't happen, they come up with a new disaster scenario. For the people peddling such predictions, they do so for the simple and lazy reason that doom and gloom is always good bait, because no one wants the thing they love taken away, so it's an easy way to get attention, get replies, and inevitably get some supporters. So if it's so spurious, why talk about it? Well, for starters, it's just been an itch on my mind, plus I'm in between a couple of projects like the Dark Origins final piece and some other works. But also, for some reason lately, I've been seeing more and more people here and there speculating or pushing this idea, vocalizing this concept, if you will, of some big reset that would lead us to, say, Warhammer 50k. I wasn't actively looking for this stuff either, but you know sometimes how you'll just keep bumping into the same person at random times and it gets kind of strange. Well, that's me lately, and seeing posts about 40k resets. A reminder for anyone new into Warhammer 40k that when we refer to 30k, this is loosely the period around the emergence of the Emperor and the Horus Heresy. When we talk about 40k, this is the era of the modern Imperium and its collective history leading to the current and most up-to-date events. Now, on the one hand, while Games Workshop did do a reset with Sigmar, I don't believe the same status is imminent or even likely for 40k. Additionally, I personally struggle to understand why it is that people think having things fast forwarded another 10,000 years would be any more interesting or worthwhile. If you wanted to push me to put a reason to it, I would suggest maybe these are people who like to discuss primarily around the big factional and character events in the lore, or its broader philosophical and ideological concepts, and less so the details of the inner workings of factions and their political or straight power struggles. Because the bigger issues in 40k, or the more straightforward ones anyway, have been discussed by now to the nth degree. And because of this, some people have simply just become bored. Now, to my mind, if people just dug down a little, they'd see that there's already mountains of lore detail to be consumed and resolved in 40k as it stands now. And this is where I feel it's coming from though. This desire to have some concrete foundations for speculation, and not much more than that. Things in our own world now move faster than ever, and so I could easily imagine how for many, especially people coming new into the verse like 40k, which moves incredibly slowly compared to many others, is literal agony for the people who enjoy spending a lot of time in forum, Reddit, Chan, speculation fests. Either way, I guess I should say, to cover both sides, it's certainly not an impossibility that we could eventually end up with something like a refreshed game in a future 50k universe. It's just that it's unlikely to happen anywhere in the near future. And when I say near future, I mean that in 40k franchise terms, so I would be very doubtful we'd see any such thing even in the next 10 years. And if you're judging by the general pace of narrative development, that's not a negative criticism, by the way, it's just that these things take time, and rightly so. Smashing out any old nonsense in short order just to appease the drooling pleb masses leads to malaise and a sea of glossy but tedious crap. Just take your pick of examples: the end of Game of Thrones, not that I ever watched it because it's shite; the rebooted Doctor Who. If you're up for it, I'll one day explain, like some grouchy old man on his soapbox, why the old Doctor Who was far superior to the abomination it became, full of crying and CGI. And sorry to say, but millions of people can be wrong. Any number of series that started strong but basically just ran out of the writer's source material, because usually that's the key to these big series and franchises. It's all down to the writing, and I often feel that doesn't get given enough credit. But basically, when you run out of that source material, it just turns to crap. Handmaid's Tale is another one. But on top of all of this, you can take the obvious, very gruel, sludge, milquetoast state of the AAA gaming industry, which to my astonishment people seem to be slowly waking up to the fact that it's become this watered down dross that just isn't worth paying out for, no matter how much ray tracing it has going on. So I was very pleased, for example, to see the absolute death of Anthem right out of the gate, because it just didn't deserve to be anything. So when I say things move very slowly in 40k, this is not a bad thing at all. It's just a general historical observation of how quickly things move from Games Workshop. But still, opening a discussion about the merits of change to both the lore and tabletop is a can of worms for another day, to be sure. So I thought to myself, just where is all this end of 40k, reset 50k stuff coming from? And I don't mean where is it literally being discussed, but more what is it that's triggering people to think about it at all? Well, as I said originally, the simplistic 2D version basically stems from the change that happened with Sigmar, coupled with attention seeking and baiting. But beyond that, you remember how I've often had some mini rants about people writing fan fiction lore, and that it often just spins off the deep end, not staying grounded, which in fairness is already a pretty loose concept when it comes to 40k, but how this, and without me wanting to sound like a joy killer, can be problematic because it can lead to people becoming confused, and as these things mix in with existing canon, or at the least maybe thinking that any of it can somehow be on the cards for the future. And you might be standing by to say to me, look, come on Luton, nobody could mix up fiction and existing lore in terms of fan fiction or community fiction and lore. You know, are you sure about that? Yeah, I am sure about that, because I have actively lost count now of people coming to me challenging within air quotes established lore, that when I actually take the time to go and check and look and really dig down and come back to them with the fact that there's just no such evidence, this is often genuinely surprising to people, because they've heard whatever it is repeated so many times, and they've had people maybe on like Reddit or a forum somewhere just out and out come and say to them like, you know, this is established, this is a fact in the lore. It's bollocks. It's often nothing. It's groundless, completely baseless. So this confusion does happen, and when something is already as complex as 40k, it often feels to me like kind of managing an infection, if you want. Yet people clearly read this stuff thinking that it's a quote from a published source, and then they go on to start reiterating this to others as such. And this is where I think speculations like these stem from, because while I enjoy good lore fiction and invented things from people's own imagination, it can sometimes stray over from being creative fun into being problematic for those who are maybe trying to help keep track of the established events and details, and maybe make solid predictions for the future too. The origins of misinformation, to my mind, would usually just happen when poorly informed people, and again, that's not a stab at anybody, just a fact, want to flex their rich knowledge to others, because to be fair, it can take a long time, especially in 40k, to actually have read enough to be able to start solid discussions and speculation. And in 2019, patience is not a well-known trait for many people. Everybody wants everything straight away, so this is where I believe we would start to see some mistakenly passing off headcanon fiction or speculation as official source material, or even just kind of mixing it all together, and then the person that they've informed will do the same, and so on, and it becomes this horrible mess. And this is how we've ended up with commonly accepted but totally baseless ideas like the Baneblade was originally a scout tank and Nurgle was the first Chaos God. This, and of course everybody's favourite clickbait of, ooh, what happens when the Emperor dies and or returns? It's like moths bumping into a light bulb. Reminded to myself, make a video about speculating on the return of the Emperor. So now, it's obvious to anybody that this is all a natural pitfall of a universe with a very deep and complex lore. But it's also why I've said that if you want to write some lore fiction, and I say lore fiction because I've never really liked the term fan fiction, but there's kind of a whole other rant, but the short version is, when you say stuff like fan fiction, it feels like saying fan art, which I think somehow makes it sound kind of less legitimate than official work, which I guess in a way it is. But fan art, fan fiction, it sounds like something a child sends into their favourite show, but then it just gets thrown straight in the bin and is generally worthless, and I don't feel that's fair. In reality, some fan content can be often superior to official content. But anyway, if you wanted to write some lore fiction, as I'm writing currently regarding the Imperial planet, the Luton Necropolis, which I will remind is by just a bizarre coincidence a real planet in the lore. It's not something I've just made up. In fact, there's even an audio drama set in that planet, so it's mental, but that's something I'm working on. Now personally, I find it much more palatable for personal fiction to be grounded by the established confines of what we already know. You could include some small speculative, invented details, but not go jumping off the deep end into wild speculation. Now, to be absolutely clear, that isn't to say that you can't do this. It's a lot of fun to let the imagination run wild, but just for myself, I think that more often than not, when people do this, it can be likened to the old adage of your eyes being bigger than your stomach. It all looks so delicious and ripe for the plucking in the mind's eye, but then when you actually get into it, it all just ends up being too much. You can just be thinking too big, and that's when it starts to become sour and unpalatable. What's worth keeping in mind is that most 40k official material rarely makes huge changes or big sweeping statements. Even when they're trying to do that, they do it in a very subtle way. It's more drip, drip, drip. So when people write these big sweeping headcanon that upend everything, it kind of goes against the grain. And I personally find well written and well understood lore fiction much more appealing than bonkers theories about how there's going to be 20 more chaos gods or whatever. The most important thing is just to clearly label your work so all can be sure that it's personal, headcanon, unofficial work that's not any part of any approved concept or timeline, be it existing or in development. Although, as we all know these days, writing things in huge signage in black and white text is still not enough for things to always be clear to everyone. But coming back to our original thought regarding some kind of reset, the fact of the matter is that there really is very little reason for Games Workshop to push the reset button, and also little reason for us as an audience to want them to do so either, in my opinion. I mean, for one thing, they've only just finished setting up some pretty major scenarios that are just getting started and probably have a long way to go before they're resolved. The Eldar have the rise of Aeneid, chaos are causing chaos, and the Imperium is facing a strange position where they're stronger than they have been for millennia, yet simultaneously more fractured and even closer to the edge of complete annihilation, arguably more so than in living memory of many Imperials. For all the other factions, it's business as usual. Tyranids are munching and encroaching, orcs are headbutting each other to oblivion, and the Tau are still learning that not every stranger is a friend you haven't met. Necrons continue to be chill, soulless, and ready to wait out the mortal creatures by means of the weapon of time, while also being strangely purposeful about a tactic that just requires you to be sleeping until everyone else is dead. And the Dark Eldar are of course too busy flaying prey things and bathing in the blood of their victims to be far too concerned about whatever else is going on. But another contributing factor to this interest of moving things forward is that people have spent so long now being immersed in the Heresy series of novels, or people coming fresh into 40k and then ploughing through the novels. They want more similarly grand tales of glory and destruction. They want to see the characters and so on continue and develop. And unfortunately, the big problem with this is that most Primarchs are dead or missing. The Emperor is a rotting carcass being held together by the sinews of sacrificed psychic power, and the Imperium itself as an empire has been wallowing in its decaying stagnation and slowly unravelling. A lot of what we know in the current era of 40k is long established. It's really only Belisarius Cawl and the return of Robert Guilliman that has brought some semblance of order, direction and focus for the Imperium again. Yet there are plenty of questions around this as well. Questions like why hasn't Robert gone on the rampage against, say, the ecclesiarchy and the general concept of the Imperial Creed. As far as he as a Primarch is concerned, the Imperial truth, or the ideology at least of the Emperor, should still be being enforced. Yet he doesn't seem too concerned about this, possibly because he realises there are vastly more pressing matters to attend to and such internal issues can be dealt with down the line. But this is really an elephant in the room that will have to be addressed at some point because it truly cannot be ignored. That's a reminder, Games Workshop, cannot be ignored. This would likely trigger a whole new civil war within the Imperium, and that itself is quite a tantalizing and exciting prospect. I think that if the Imperium were able to vanquish chaos and somehow seal the rift tearing the galaxy in half, which could be possible now we know that the Necron are open to alliances so long as it's mutually beneficial. And who knows what bargain could be struck. Or the Eldar, maybe they will seek aid in their quest to fully unleash Aeneid, and this could be achieved by them under a pretense of it being helpful to the monkey by greatly diminishing the powers of chaos, and who knows what a reborn Eldar society would be capable of, because the lore suggests it was either themselves or the Necron who sealed the rift between the Materium and the Immaterium in the past, and this could be achieved again. In terms of lore advancement though, until recently, and recently being the past 4 to 5 years, 40k had really been developing at a glacial pace. When I first got into 40k back in the early 90s, it was the second edition of 40k, and nothing would really change through multiple editions. Sure, we had some new races here and there, but no significant events that would alter the landscape in any hugely meaningful way. Nothing at all like the events of the Gathering Storm. And this is again where I should remind that the lore and the tabletop are very much separate, yet also interconnected, and that nothing has really been added or changed in a major way because of this fact. And because the narrative has generally been about the Imperium being stagnant, this was by design, the entire premise of 40k, because remember, it was primarily a tabletop game, and the lore was simply background material to make it interesting and fleshed out. Now in real terms, there was no need or desire to move things forward. No one was especially interested on what was going to happen with the Emperor or anything else. It was a deliberate dead end. We had reached the present time, or the tail end of the 41st millennium, and this is why every rulebook for 40k always starts with the same copied and pasted dogmatic speech, setting the scene, always the same, because for the longest time this really was the end of the story so far. You didn't need to know anymore, because the lore was merely the backdrop for the tabletop game. And this is, to my mind, the reason why a lot of novels and so on deal with events in the past or the vague present, but rarely ever until just recently do they deal with the present moving forward. In past years though, we've seen Forge World producing 30k models for people fighting battles of historical heresy events, and there has of course been significant development in terms of new models from Games Workshop with the Primaris and so on, and this continues unabated, as recently as the past few weeks with many new releases. It's always been a fairly common assumption that all of this is very directly related with the choices made by the senior heads of Games Workshop that are driving the direction and purpose for the company, and for the longest time the focus seemed to be heavily on the tabletop game and little else. Background lore material was just interesting, fun fluff, as some like to refer to it as, and back then I really think that's what it was, but over time it was clear that there was much more of an audience for such things than maybe had been thought about, and similarly the growth of interest in the painting side of things has only grown and grown. So while each area of 40k has always had its own audience, each of these has continued to grow out, and I would suggest that now, while all three main areas of interest in 40k are still intrinsically linked, they also can be seen as being much more standalone areas of the hobby than they have been for decades. And Games Workshop thankfully has been pretty smart about embracing this, and this shows in their huge success as a business in the past few years. For me, it's been great to see some actual development again, even if I'm not a big fan of the Primaris, and I do like the fact that they brought back a Primarch to spearhead the Imperium so as to begin tentatively moving in a forward direction. Similarly, the somewhat controversial figure of Belisarius Cawl, who walks a thin, heretical line, but he is making forward progress, and this has led to some strong speculation as to what could still be to come for redevelopment of the forces of the Imperium. So as I say, given all of this, I think the likelihood of us seeing the end of 40k anytime soon is very unlikely, because why would Games Workshop want to roll the dice and aggravate the community just as it's reaching a larger audience than ever? Can you imagine what a huge pain in the ass it would be to reset everything, let alone the expense of such a thing? They'd probably have to en masse revise most of the models currently in use, and a huge proportion of the community would be very bitter and pissed off, maybe even decide to call it quits at that point. So it just makes no sense whatsoever to do anything like this. For myself, I could list endless reams of developments I want to see resolved in the current 40k verse, and we still have the best part of 10,000 years to go. I want to see the Inari be successful in unleashing Aeneid, leading to the true rebirth of the Eldar and the destruction of Slaanesh. These are events that I think could happen, but would undoubtedly make those with, say, a Chaos Slaanesh army pretty unhappy. I want to see if Rubik Guilliman will eventually deal with the Ecclesiarchy situation and maybe could see a new civil war break out within the Imperium. Will the Tau launch some new massive sphere of expansion while the Imperium is weakened and divided? Likewise, the Orc and Tyranid threats make opportunistic incursions. I think everything is on the table, and we know that Cawl has been developing more and more new tech, and as I've said, if Cawl continues with further genetic or neurological experimentation, maybe the Imperium will move to where Primaris become the absolute default Astartes force, and standard power armor becomes more regularly issued to, say, senior members of the Imperial Guard, and maybe even beyond that. Not to mention extension, we could see the return of various missing in action Primarchs, as well as other possibilities that I won't mention but read between the lines. Things are undoubtedly leading toward a 42nd millennium which is unrestrained in its harshness and potential developments. Within where we are right now, or even just events that are still to be fleshed out in the past of the Imperium, 40k has mountains of material to work with. There's simply no need to reset, nor is it likely in my opinion. There has always been the significant advantage when it comes to 40k over the fantasy game that the scope, the scale, the sheer potential for new material to appear from anywhere, and it's why the two things shouldn't ever be compared or connected. It's also why I've got fairly limited interest in the fantasy game, and I know some of you guys have asked me to do the lore for it. The honest truth is that I have a pretty bare bones working knowledge of the fantasy side and would have to spend significant time to get myself up to speed on it, but I'm also just simply not a big fan of fantasy genres in general. It's not something I really enjoy, but the limitations of its world compared to the galaxy that is 40k is also why something like Sigmar is possible within the fantasy game, but far less likely to occur in something like 40k because they can just kind of write around it. So now that we know we're going to be staying firmly in the era of 40k and that the Emperor isn't coming back anytime soon and that we won't be seeing Heresy 2, let's crack on with the awesome lore that's already established, maybe flesh out in a few more fictions the background details of the worlds in the Imperium for the lore side of things, different Imperial world types, orc culture, Tyranid campaigns. There's a lot to work with, and with that in mind, I'll have something related coming up very soon. September is going to be a packed and busy month, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching as always, guys. If you enjoyed, tell me what you think down below, and I'll see you next time.